Welcome to today's presentation by Dr. Eva Reifert, curator of the exhibition Castaway Modernism at Kunstmuseum Basel. Please post your questions in the chat or Q&A section. I'm Rachel Stern, Director and CEO of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art based in New York. We research, discuss, publish and exhibit artists whose life and work were affected by the German Nazi regime between 1933 and 1945. Today I welcome Dr. Eva Reifert, who is the curator of 19th century and modern art at Kunstmuseum Basel, Switzerland. She has mounted numerous presentations from the collection and major exhibitions, among them the Cubist Cosmos in 2019 and Sophie Teuber-Arp in 2021, a collaboration with MoMA. Prior to her post in Basel, she was a trainee at the Bavarian State Paintings Collections in Munich and an Andrew W. Mellon Curatorial Fellow at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where she worked on the exhibition project Unfinished Thoughts Left Visible. She received her PhD from Freie Universität Berlin in 2011. Welcome, Eva.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you for the invitation and also for this brief introduction. I think we'll jump right into it. As you've said, I'm going to talk about the show that is now on view until the 19th of February. It's called Castaway Modernism, and it tells the story of the acquisitions of degenerate art that the Kunstmuseum Basel made in 1939. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen with all of you and hope that you can now see the presentation.
Mm-hmm.
Does that work?
Yes.
Great, wonderful. So you'll all be in the know about the basically the background of this exhibition, because it's the background of the 1930s and the Nazi era. So the National Socialists came to power in 1933, and as you may know already, they wanted to make an example of modern art that did not conform to their ideology and racial science. So in 1937 they denounced 21,000 paintings, sculptures and works on paper as degenerate and removed them from German museums. The best known of these works were then sold abroad to raise revenues in foreign currencies. And this is then where the Kunstmuseum Basel comes in, because in the summer of 1939, the Kunstmuseum acquired altogether 21 eminent works formerly held by German museums. So what we wanted to do with this exhibition was to look very closely at this moment in our collection history, which is arguably one of the most important ones, since these acquisitions became then the foundation of our modern collection, which is today world-renowned. But we are also very clear that they were a business deal with a dictatorial government. And in the exhibition, we are also trying to situate the Basel acquisitions within a broader perspective of the losses in connection with the Nazi regime's persecution of degenerate art. So I'm showing you here on the next slide, the Kunstmuseum Basel today. On the left, you see the Neubau building where the exhibition is held. And on the right, you see the main building, which is today called the Hauptbau, but which was in 1936 itself the new building. In 1936, this new building, so here you see a contemporary photograph from that time, was inaugurated, and suddenly there was more space for the collection than ever before. And the collection at that point was very famous already throughout Europe and almost the world for its holding of old masters, like, for example, Holbein the Younger and Konrad Witz here on the right-hand side, and also the Basel symbolist painter Arnold Böcklin. You see the Island of the Dead in the middle of the slide. However, when these new spacious rooms were opened in the new building, it was suddenly painfully clear that there was very, very little modern art in the collection. So here you go. This is how the modern collection basically looked like around 1937. And this is what it looked like after the events we are discussing in the exhibition. You'll notice among these acquisitions, Franz Marc's Fate of the Animals or Oskar Kokoschka's famous Bride of the Wind, and a few other really world famous works that today are almost to be seen in any history of art. So before we go into the exhibition, I thought it might be easier for you to follow the talk if you had a layout beforehand, and I'm going to give you a short overview. So you basically come up the stairs and then go into the first room, which is designated Basel 1937, the modern collection, which is where we start by basically saying there was almost nothing here in terms of modern art. And then there's the second room in which we are going to discuss the term of degenerate art in Germany, and also the exhibition that was famously held in Munich at the time. Then there's one room that shows how an entire generation of not yet internationally known German artists was affected by the confiscations. And we then look more closely at the art that the National Socialists wanted to sell abroad, and in the center room, focus on the discussion at the time of whether or not at all to buy degenerate art for Basel. And then in the second half of the exhibition, we are talking about the two different ways these acquisitions were made: through an official auction of degenerate art in Lucerne that you may have heard about, and through direct sales from Berlin. All right, I think we're now ready to enter the first room, and just to give you an idea, the talk is going to be about 30 to 40 minutes at the most. So there's plenty of time for your questions later. So here we are in the first room, and we talk here about the new building opened in 1936. And as I said, how suddenly it was so clear that after decades really of struggling with a lack of space, the modern collection was no match for the old master holdings. The first room thus just holds these 6 works that constituted the modern and contemporary collection until 1939. And among them, you see here on the right, on the left-hand side on the slide, Max Ernst's Great Forest. On the right-hand side, you see one of the wooden panels that we have in each room. And they are basically your go-to point where you know that you're going to get all the information you need. So they hold very short texts. I'm very proud of these texts because I've worked on them for almost half a year, so that they're just like 500 characters. And then there are these silent films which we commissioned that give you 3 minutes of context and lots of historical photographs. Then we move on into the second room. This is now situated in Germany in 1937. And here, as I said, we are discussing the term of degenerate art, the confiscations that were made at the time from German museums, and the Munich exhibitions. So, of course, it's very difficult if you have a room of a few square meters to talk about a phenomenon that encompasses 21,000 confiscated works of art, sculptures, paintings, and works on paper. But we decided to talk about this on almost a symbolical level. So we have this wonderful work, The Descent from the Cross by Max Beckmann in the show, which is today at MoMA in New York, and which was seized at the time from the Städel Museum in Frankfurt. And of course, you all know Chagall's Rabbi. The campaign's primary target, as you know, I'm sure, were works by Jewish artists or with Jewish or political themes. But in general, you can say that everything that looked too modern, that was too creative, too free-spirited, all these works were deemed degenerate. And many of the confiscated works were then sent on to the Degenerate art show, of which you see an installation shot on the left-hand side. And you see how the National Socialists made it so that this art that they wanted to denigrate was shown in the least respectful manner imaginable. So you have this very apparent script on the wall, these writings on the wall, basically, and the disrespectful assembly of works. They are almost stacked one on top of the other. And on the other hand, of course, on the right-hand side, you see what it looked like when a sort of art had the Nazi regime's approval, very official, the Nazi insignia, very almost beautifully installed rooms. And that was the other exhibition at the same time that showcased works that were official art, basically, of the Nazi regime, the Great German Art Exhibition. And in this second room, we also show a letter of the then director of the Basel Kunstmuseum, who was called Otto Fischer. He wrote in 1937, after having seen this Degenerate art show in Munich, to an acquaintance, then a staunch Nazi, and he inquired whether the art seized from German museums was for sale and what was to happen to it. In the third room, we speak of this generation of young artists that I mentioned, these artists who in the 1930s had only just started their careers. So some of their works had already entered museum collections, which also often happened through acquisitions that the democratic government of the Weimar Republic had made, because they had wanted to support artists in an economically difficult time. And these works too were seized from the German museums as degenerate, but when the National Socialists then began to consider marketability, so basically when they wanted to sell the art that they had just confiscated abroad, they had, of course, no use for works by these younger artists that were still largely unknown. And that's a phenomenon that's very, very important to this exhibition, and that really I wanted to draw attention to. So many of their works of art were, of course, also taken from the German museums, but they were subsequently destroyed because the National Socialists did not have any use for them. And we've tried to bring together in a very concise and condensed room beautiful works, wonderful works from this generation of immense quality, and that also show the range of subject in these interwar years. So from what I hear from visitors when I'm over there in the exhibition, and I sometimes try to just get an idea of what their impressions are, these works really are a discovery for most of the visitors. In the fourth room, we then take a closer look at the Nazi category of internationally sellable art, which is, of course, very important for the Basel story, because this is where basically that phenomenon that forms the link between the confiscations, the selling of modern art, and a museum abroad that used this chance to amplify its collection. So of these works confiscated from German museums, those that were really well known, and by well-known artists, they were set aside for sale abroad to gain the urgently needed funds in foreign currencies that the Nazis wanted. Here are just two examples, one by Karl Hofer, who was a preeminent painter of the Weimar period, and of Erich Heckel, The Spring in Flanders. Here's a picture of the storage room that was then set up. So basically from these from the totality of the confiscated works, there were 780 paintings and sculptures and 3,500 works on paper that were categorized as internationally sellable. And they were gathered in the special warehouse in the Palace of Berlin-Schönhausen in 1938, of which you see a picture here on the right-hand side. And there was a plan to liquidate the stock by the Reich Ministry of Propaganda. And they planned to do so by holding an auction in Switzerland, more on that in a minute. And they commissioned 4 art dealers to approach potential buyers directly. And among them was the new director at the Kunstmuseum in Basel, Georg Schmidt. He was invited to visit this palace or this warehouse in Berlin, and there he saw major works of German and French modernism. On the left-hand side, you see 2 of 7 sheets of a long, long list that was sent to Georg Schmidt by these Nazi art dealers, or the art dealers that were commissioned by the Nazis. And this is, as I said, just an excerpt. The list is much longer. And it was for us very important to see during the preparations of the exhibition that Georg Schmidt, during his Berlin visit, so when he went to this storage room in Berlin, that he didn't just look at the art that was listed here on this list, but that he also asked his hosts to show him art that was not considered sellable by the National Socialists. And that of these works, he chose some to be sent to Basel. In the central room of the exhibition, we are then back in Basel in 1939 with the question, that is the center question, to buy or not to buy. Georg Schmidt basically had returned from his Berlin visit and was determined to build a modern collection. And in a meeting in early June, he then persuades the trustees. So we have this board of trustees who is called the Kunstkommission, and they still today, they need to approve of all the acquisitions. And he wants to persuade them to purchase works formerly held by German museums. He also wanted to do so through these 2 sources. He wanted to buy directly in Berlin, but also at the officially planned auction in Lucerne. So this is somewhat of a speciality for Basel, as you will see, that there was basically this direct contact to the Berlin art dealers. The debate about these acquisitions was very contentious. Many of the trustees didn't even want to buy German art and would have much preferred to acquire something French. It's very interesting to go through the minutes of these meetings and see how that was really not a clear-cut case that Basel would even get involved at the time. And in the end, though, the Board of Trustees then asked the Canton of Basel-Stadt, you know that in Switzerland, the cantons are basically like states. That is, they asked the government to provide funding to finance the acquisitions. And then follows another politically controversial debate, this time on the government level. And in the end, the request is green-lighted. We've collected, and that's something that you can see here on the right-hand side, we've collected all the divergent opinions and different arguments in this debate and basically compiled a 20-minute loop in German and English so that visitors in the exhibition, in this central room of the exhibition, can follow the debate and can basically have their own questions posed or sometimes maybe answered. And it's a very strong moment, I think, together with this historic architecture that we still found in the storage room that actually dates from back then. And of course, the central work, Franz Marc's Animal Destinies, which was the first acquisition that was made back then, and a work that was even at the time already famous. Georg Schmidt acquired the work even before he knew that he would have the money to do so. So that's also a very interesting detail in the story. Now we are already in the second half of the exhibition. This is room 6. And here we take a closer look at the Lucerne auction in 1939, which I mentioned. This auction was called Modern Masters from German Museums, and it was held by the Galerie Fischer on June 30th of the same year. This is a famous photograph when the Rabbi by Marc Chagall is being auctioned off. And there were in total 125 works listed in this catalog that you see on the left. And they were all taken from the warehouse of this internationally sellable stock at the Schönhausen Palace. And there are 350 prospective buyers in the audience from Switzerland and from across the world. And here on the right-hand side, you see a picture, and in the front row to the left, you see the Basel director, Georg Schmidt. So back to this question of funds. It was just the evening before this auction took place that the Basel government had granted half of the sum that the Kunstkommission had asked for. So basically the Basel delegation that was then sent to Luzern to partake in the auction, they only had half of what they expected to have at their disposal. And that of course had far-reaching consequences for the selection of works that they wanted to acquire, because it became clear very quickly that they couldn't acquire what they so badly wanted, Matisse and Picasso. And so they made these hasty changes that you can follow on this document on the left-hand side, which is not orderly anymore. Normally these lists in our documents, in our archival materials are very orderly. And here it's just utter chaos. And you can see how they crossed out things that they couldn't get, the Lehmbruck, for example, and the Corinth, and how others are like underlined and highlighted, and how this document, I think, just speaks to the sort of chaotic situation they found themselves in. So with these roughly half of the 50,000 francs then appropriated by the government, the delegation acquired 8 pictures. So here you see the Chagall, Corinth, Klee, Paula Modersohn-Becker's famous self-portrait, the parents by Dix, the Derain and the Franz Marc. And it was all in all, I think, this moment of the Luzern auction, a moment of just a giant redistribution of modern art in general. Very high profile works, as you've seen. And 86 of these 125 works entered private and public collections outside of Germany that day. And today, of course, if you visit museums throughout the world, you'll encounter them because they're redistributed all over the world. This is the 7th room and the 8th one. And these 2 rooms are basically a unity. Here we speak about the additional acquisitions then made from Berlin, because as I said, Basel did not just buy at this official auction in Luzern, but after his visit to Berlin, Georg Schmidt had requested that 20 works from those that he had seen there be sent to Basel for inspection for his board of trustees, the Kunstkommission. So 2 weeks after the Luzern auction, the trustees came together again in the new building to look at these 20 works. They were basically lined up there along the walls, and the majority of them also came from the Schönhausen Palace. But as I mentioned, there were 5 works by Oskar Schlemmer and by Georg Schrimpf that were an exception to this rule, because the National Socialists had not considered them as suitable to be sold abroad. But Georg Schmidt had insisted anyway, and had been taken by Buchholz to this shed, is what he calls it, where these works that were on commission of this art dealer were housed. The problem was that what remained of the government's acquisitions fund was not enough to purchase all the works that Schmidt had ordered, because he at the time had, of course, thought that he would have a larger sum. And the trustees therefore needed to make a selection. And we've also included the minutes of this Board of Trustees meeting from July 14th in the exhibition. and a very interesting letter in French, as you'll see here on the right-hand side, written by a Belgian government official that reports to colleagues from the Liège Museum about what he regarded as secret sales from the Berlin ministry to a Swiss museum. And it's clear by the works that he mentions that he meant Georg Schmidt and the Kunstmuseum Basel. And this is just one of the stories that came to light during our preparations for this exhibition that it's just all these details that give you a broader sense of the not just nervous energy, but really of these months in the summer of 1939, shortly before the outbreak of the war. This is the second half of these two rooms. So here we tell the story of how in 1941, so we skip 2 years, after really having tried everything in his power to keep the works that were sent to Basel here through exchanges with 19th century art, through exchanges with other works, by asking private donors for money, nothing worked at the time. And these 9 works that could not be acquired because the funds weren't sufficient, they had to be sent back to the Berlin Reich's Ministry of Propaganda. And 2 of them are today lost. Others have been have entered other collections. And these lost works, you've seen one of them already, that was the Schlemmer in the middle of these 2 other Schlemmer works, and you see another one here on the left. That's the Widow by Otto Dix. We've included them as projections, which gives them in the exhibition, I think, a sort of almost ghost-like presence. But we've also given them plate illustrations in the catalog, huge illustrations. We basically treat them like any other work in the show, and they've accompanying texts also in the booklet. So we treat them as if they were still extant. And then in this context, we also tell the story of Otto Dix's Trench, which you see here on the far right, which is a work that Georg Schmidt really time and again inquires after, tried for months to have it sent to Basel. It was a highly controversial work because it showed the First World War that Otto Dix had seen and basically recorded as an eyewitness in paint in the goriest details. And it's but it's also a centennial work. It's just a masterpiece, but it is also today likely destroyed. Georg Schmidt did not achieve his goal to have it sent to Basel too. So in the end, with the acquisitions from Berlin, 21 works of modern art, as I said, entered the Basel collection in 1939, 8 from Lucerne, and 13 together with the Animal Destinies by Franz Marc from Berlin. The last room was incredibly difficult to conceptualize, because how do you end a show like this, and how do you close a story like that? What do you want the visitors to basically think about when they exit the rooms? And it took really a long time to kind of come to terms with what we actually wanted to say, and then it was suddenly very, very clear. So what we decided to do was tie together the different threads mentioned in the exhibition, and above all, bring together not just the stories of acquisitions, but the stories of losses that are closely connected to them. And just have this one room almost with a commemorative spirit, I think. The acquisitions, as you can imagine, were a watershed moment for the Kunstmuseum Basel, and they became the foundation for the now world-famous modern collection. Yet our archival materials also show very clearly the loss of invaluable works. And oftentimes these stories become invisible because the artworks themselves are lost. So all you have are records in an archive, and that's something you can't exhibit, and it's very hard to talk about because it's just not physically there anymore. So we've tried our best to give these losses connected to the acquisitions a presence in this last room. And I'm going to finish with just the 5 examples that we have in the exhibition. So there was a stone cast of Mother with 2 Children by the German artist Käthe Kollwitz that was discussed between one of the art dealers and Georg Schmidt. And this stone cast did not make it to Basel and was then lost in an air raid on Berlin. There is, however, an original plaster of the work, and it's wonderful and deeply humbling to have it in the show. Then there is Ernst Barlach's head, which was the only sculpture among the works acquired in 1939. You see it here in the middle. And this mask, this head, was the face of Käthe Kollwitz, because both artists were friends. And it also belonged to a peace monument for the fallen soldiers of World War I that Barlach had created. And this peace monument was hated by the National Socialists. And it was melted down for arms production during World War II. And we in the exhibition show a recast of this peace monument. The third of these chapters is a juxtaposition of Franz Marc's 2 cats, which was acquired at the Luzern auction, and a cat painting by Jankel Adler, a Jewish artist that I think today is really only known in his home region in Germany. If you know him, I'm very, I'd be delighted, and please correct me if I'm wrong. And while Franz Marc was at that time, of course, already famous and his work therefore sold abroad, Jankel Adler is one of these examples of a lost generation. And then there's the wonderful Folly Square by Felix Nussbaum. And this work for me is a reminder that even with the broader perspective that we take on the persecution of degenerate art, this tale does not reach artists who were not yet represented in museums at the time, right? That makes sense. Of course, you could be an artist with a career in the making, and then suddenly with the uprising of the National Socialists, your career is curtailed. But just because we are taking this perspective on degenerate art and thus works that were removed from German museums, these stories don't even make it into this narration. So Nussbaum was a Jewish painter, and he went into exile in Belgium and was then later betrayed by neighbors and deported to the Auschwitz concentration camp in 1944, where he was murdered. And his art bears witness to the boundless violence visited upon the Jews by the Nazi regime. And then there's a story of hope also. The artist Mark Mull, which you see here on the right side. She also is a member of the Forgotten Generation, and we included her dancer in the show. It was displayed in the Degenerate art exhibition in 1937 and was then believed to have been destroyed. So on the right side, you see the sort of former beauty and the polished surface, and that he also had this sort of veil across her body, and she's lost all that. But at least she turned up. This work turned up in 2009 during construction work for a new subway line in Berlin, and it had spent many decades buried in the rubble of the city after the bombing. And when they restored the dancer of Mark Mull, the team decided, apparently, to leave this history of its loss partly visible and not undo all the damage that the rubble had caused. So I think that I've mentioned this before, but in the other rooms, we always have these monitors, and you have these like silent films, which give you all the context you need and show you lots of historical photographs. We've also put them online so you can find and look at them on YouTube. But here in this last room, we decided not to include this element of narration because we felt like we had already laid it all out. And instead, we decided to have a showcase of 2 letters. And that's an exchange between the director of the Kunstmuseum, Georg Schmidt, and the Jewish art critic Paul Westheim, who was already in his Paris exile at the time. And we just decided to let these 2 experts discuss the Basel acquisitions in their letters in all their details. And these letters were written right after the 13 works from Berlin had been bought, so in July 1939. And Schmidt and Westheim, they really argue about financing the National Socialist regime with these acquisitions, about saving modern art from certain destruction. It's basically a sort of summary of all these questions and conflicting feelings I'm sure you might have, and that we have too. And it's just the perfect commentary for the end of this show. We also made an audio file of it, which is very, it's just a gripping tale. And in Schmidt's letter, there's also a quote that seemed so fitting that we decided to start and finish the exhibition with it. And I'm going to read to you now. It feels like a fairy tale to me, if only the circumstances that led to it weren't so harrowingly real and brutal. And with this, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
This is truly an amazing history that you unraveled, and with so many important I wouldn't say sidelines, but so many important aspects to it. And I think I'll go right into the questions, which are, have been coming as you were speaking already, which is quite unusual. Rose is asking, why aren't the works of art sold at auction considered stolen art, since the original museums or owners had them confiscated? In light of what transpired during and after the war, was there any effort to give some artwork back to the original museums?
So as you probably all know, that there's an entire profession that deals with these sort of questions. They are called the provenance researchers. And I just have to tell you, I'm not a provenance researcher, I'm an art historian, but I'll try as best as I can to answer your question. So in 1938, there was a law issued by the National Socialists that made these confiscations lawful. Also, basically the federal states and even towns and cities had lost all right to governance by being gleichgeschaltet through the Nazi regime, even prior to this law. So basically everything that belonged to the state, and this was of course government, these were government holdings because they were in state museums. Everything that belonged to the state was also for the state to sell and to do with as they pleased. Then there's the fact that these laws have never been rescinded or retracted. I'm not sure of the correct vocabulary here. And just to give you an idea of, even if it were considered to do so, nobody's doing it, but even if it were so, just imagine that would mean that anyone who, after several changes of hand today, for whatever reason, owned one of these works, these 21,000 works that were confiscated at the time, would have to return them to the owner back then, which were, this is also something that you have to know, many of these museums directors were of course staunch National Socialists. Others, on the other hand, tried desperately to salvage their collections. So you have the full spectrum of humanity in a way. And it's just, yeah, I think that's how I would try to answer this. And for everything else, I think I would refer you to the specialists.
And I have to say, we will send with a follow-up email, we send a link to the glossary, which I find on the website of the Kunstmuseum Basel, because it makes very clear distinction between the different groups of owners, different groups of decision makers, and different groups of also artworks, and how they were treated, or how their history unraveled after 45.
Yeah, I think it's just maybe to just one more sentence on this. It's really important to know that there are the terms of Raubkunst and of Fluchtgut and of degenerate art, and what we are talking about here is really just works of art that were taken from German museums. I think I've mentioned it several times, but it's really important that nobody gets confused that these were not works that were taken from private owners. Mm-hmm. That's an entirely different affair, of course.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the term degenerate art, it feels so solid. So I'm wondering whether there are some artists that were in both exhibitions, like who decided what was degenerate art, and was that a firm definition, or was it fluid in some cases?
This was incredibly unclear also to the officials at the time, and you have these small local commissions basically raiding the museums. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you have these cases where they basically took everything where they thought their superiors would not like it. Mm-hmm. And then you have cases of what you mentioned, that there was even this confusion that in the exhibition that I mentioned, these two exhibitions in Munich, the Great German Art Exhibition and the Degenerate show, that you found the same artists that were represented in both shows, because nobody had basically thought about this before. And there are a number of these, a very small number, but a number of these cases in which they then try to basically rectify that by removing them from one or the other exhibition. Belling is, for example, in such a case.
Mm-hmm. Right. So did all the artworks that were sold on in auction survive until today? And what happened to the artwork that was not sold in auction?
So I know of several cases. So it's basically the difference between the 86 works that were sold and then the 125. There was a post sale, is that the term? Mm-hmm. So after the auction, you can still buy works. I think that played a part in the proceedings, but there are a number of works that were lost even though they were considered internationally marketable. So that was no guarantee for a work to basically reach the safe haven of a museum abroad. And I think that's just also worth of our consideration, that even this relatively high profile category, because the National Socialists could make use of them, was in danger of being destroyed or just lost.
Mm-hmm. So were there follow-up auctions, or was that the only auction and that was the end of it?
That's a very interesting question. There was just this one auction, and it is described by the experts as sort of a test balloon. They basically wanted to see whether that was a feasible way of getting foreign currencies. And they must have decided after the auction that it was not, and that it hadn't worked to their liking. And in this letter that I showed you from Belgium, such an interesting detail, really. This government official says that his impression was that this whole auction affair was a, what's the word? Basically did not work in the National Socialists' favor, because so many of the buyers had united beforehand to make sure that they divided up the works so that the prices wouldn't unnecessarily be augmented and not be driven up. For example, there are even cases where the Basel director and the director in Zurich discuss which work they want to acquire, the James Ensor that I showed, and they made sure that they wouldn't basically drive the prices up among themselves, but also for this, because they knew that it was rather unclear for what the money would be used, although the National Socialists really said that we're just going to use it to restock the German collections with art. Mm-hmm. Yes, so to your question, there was no other auction, and in this letter from Belgium, you even see it mentioned that this government official says, well, since this wasn't a success, they are going to rely on these secret sales more and more, and shouldn't we also, wouldn't our collection also benefit from these secret sales? And it's so interesting that they were considered secret, because if you look at our documents and our archival material, nobody considered them secret. It was more, I think, the impression from this government official, because there was this contact, and Schmidt even went to Berlin, and yeah, it's a very interesting question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. So you mentioned one art dealer, Buchholz, who was involved in the sales of the art and in direct sales, but there were others too, right? Yeah. Do you have an idea of the percentage of art that they were able to sell?
So we were in direct contact at the time with Hildebrand Gurlitt and with Karl Buchholz. These were the two that had basically divided up the works that they would approach Basel with. I can't give you precise numbers. I'm almost sure this is known to the literature, and there are research projects dedicated specifically to each of these men and their stock and their commissions and what they sold and what did not sell. But off the top of my head, I couldn't tell now.
Mm-hmm. Right. So one audience member is wondering what occurred to the works that were not deemed internationally saleable by the Third Reich. And my question on top of that is, were there any works found after? I mean, you mentioned this one unbelievable case of the dancer, but right after the end of the war, where the deposits like opened, and were there artworks still found, or what's the story there?
So what occurred to these artists that were not sold abroad, that's specifically what I wanted to achieve with this exhibition, that we drew the attention also to the fact that, of course, we could only be offered art that the National Socialists had priorly chosen. Mm-hmm. And then that there was this, the fact that Georg Schmidt still regained this sort of agency and inquired specifically after art that had not been chosen for international sale. So that's one of these details that was very interesting. And then many of these other works that were not useful for the National Socialists were then destroyed. So there are records or strong hints at a sort of autodafé, a burning of works of art, very similar to what had occurred with books. And in general, that's a very big question that you're asking there, because the fact that they were not deemed internationally sellable led to the fact that they were not present in public collections abroad. With the sort of presence abroad by the works that had reached international museums, for example, through the auction, came a sort of intensified attention because of their history of defamation, which did not occur with the works that had not even reached other museums and that had stayed in Germany or had been destroyed. So these artists and their career really suffered in many-folded ways, because they were not recognized abroad. They didn't have a career. Many of them were persecuted as Jews, for example, or because of their political orientation. And after the war, when this entire generation of artists was basically rehabilitated, they fell through the cracks, because it would have been incredibly difficult to draw them into the light again with almost nothing written on them, with so many works lost, with little in the way of critical opinion about their work. So what happened was that after the war, of course, degenerate art was widely rehabilitated, but almost exclusively with the artwork that had been sold abroad. So you know Chagall, you know he's a great artist, let's rehabilitate him. And they became almost symbols. For example, the fact that our Corinth painting, the Ecce Homo, is so famous is because it was the cover motif of the first book on the ostracization of art. So they had a sort of audience, and the other generation that had stayed in Germany and was basically too young to be recognized or to have had a career, they basically just were forgotten.
Mm-hmm. Right. So that's why I very much appreciate that you have devoted a whole gallery in your exhibition to this forgotten generation, which I care very much about.
Yes, yeah. No, and also it's not just this one gallery. So for me, it's very important that we don't try to ghettoize them, right? We don't just have one room and then say, oh, look, we cared about them and now let's forget about it. But we are including their works, for example, Katz, Hans Katz, wonderful portrait of a man in the second room. So we are telling the entire story already by including these artists. Mm-hmm. And by Meitner is another example. I don't think he's that widely known outside of Germany, and that's also part of the story. Jankel Adler in the last room, Mark Moll. So they reappear wherever it's possible. And it's really not just this one gallery, and it's written. This interest is written into the more general attempt to narrate this whole history, not just as one of gains and of acquisitions, but really to point out how many losses there are in the wider perspective of degenerate art in general, works taken from German museums, but also in the very narrow perspective of which works came to Basel and which are today lost or did make it into other collections.
Yeah. So Marcy is asking a question. She says, just as such an illuminating discussion. Thank you both. Dr. Reifert, can you please also clarify the details of Göring's huge confiscated art collection? That's leading a little bit away from, much actually away from your topic, but I think it's important to distinguish the two different themes. Did Göring obtain any of his stolen art at confiscated works at later auctions?
You know, I'm very sorry to say this, and I hate it when other people do this, but I'm going to leave this to the experts. I will have to ask for your understanding again, because these are such almost any of these details that you're, for example, now asking about, or that we've mentioned during this discussion, they are in and of themselves areas of research for specialists.
Mm-hmm.
And I could do no good giving you an uninformed opinion here.
Right.
And this is just not the, you know, not the area of my expertise. So I'd ask you to just let us stay within my area of expertise, because this is also such a sensitive subject, right? If I said anything and it would be wrong, that's just not,
Yeah.
doesn't help you.
Yes, I think it's just important to really clarify the area we're talking about. We're talking about museums, about museum collections, and about the sale of art that was categorized as degenerate by the Nazis, and their sale or destruct. What happened to these artworks that were taken out of German museums? And so Ilona asks the question, will this history of these artworks that you spoke about today be shown on the label, like being of these artworks in your museum? Like, do you refer to that history, or do you think all the museums that bought art in these auctions or directly from Berlin, do you think they should, you know, make people aware of that history?
I'm very impressed by your audience. Yes, we've decided that in the summer that we are going to just have a sort of, what's the word, like just an additional sort of information. So as you know, when you visit museums, there's the credit line, and then there's, of course, the possibility to just give a little bit of information on something.
Mm-hmm.
And we will not have a sort of full-blown provenance report, because that gets very tiring for people, but just have a sort of like 2 lines saying this was removed as degenerate art in 1937 from the Städel Museum in Frankfurt. That was then acquired with government funds in 1939 by the Kunstmuseum Basel. And that's it.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that this is something special. And it's a sort of nod to this very complicated history. And it was really important to us to have a sort of change in the permanent collection after this exhibition, and not just go back to the, you know, like to include them. I mean, we've done this before. When I started here several years ago, we already had a sort of presentation that was that elaborated on the historical background of these acquisitions. But still, I think it's very good to have this in the labels themselves. So thank you for this excellent question.
Yeah, I think it's a you know, I really love this desire to, you know, become more and more transparent about these historical facts, because it's and the histories of the artworks, because it reminds us of the history. It's kind of, you know, creates memorials to that and reminders of that history. And I think that's extremely important. You know, like the stumbling stones, you kind of always, you know, find, you know, reminders of, yes, this artwork would be in wherever in Frankfurt if the Nazis wouldn't have, you know, done what they have done. And so I think that's incredible, as almost a memorial, really.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you, Eva. Time flew by. Thank you for your important work and for speaking with us today. In response to our invitation to this event, I received an email from Harriet Sepinwall yesterday, which I very much agree with, and I quote, "I've been to the Kunstmuseum many times when there's an amazing collection of modern art. I do not recall any previous exhibits at the Kunstmuseum in Basel that highlighted works that were part of the 1939 purchase of this collection of what the Nazis designated as degenerate art. In this time when we have just observed the International Day of Holocaust Remembrance and will be approaching Yom HaShoah in the spring, this exhibit provides the opportunity to focus on this aspect of the Holocaust. Perhaps it will lead to other museums becoming more transparent about their own links to Holocaust-era purchases for their collections. I'm very grateful to the curator, Dr. Eva Reifert, for organizing this exhibit and look forward to seeing the exhibit as well as to the discussion that will follow," end quote. And I encourage everyone to see the exhibition, which is on view until February 19 at Kunstmuseum Basel in Switzerland. Thank you so much. Take good care and stay well. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.